Hello, I'm Christoph, your guide to the human brain and nervous system. Today we're talking about ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and what it looks like in the nervous system. First, a big caveat, ADHD is very complex and heterogeneous. It looks different in different people. In fact, it used to be that there was ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder, and ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Some people have more attention deficit, and some people have more physical hyperactivity. And as we go into what it looks like in the nervous system, we find that there is a lot of heterogeneity in what it looks like in the brain. Some folks who have ADHD, it's affecting one part of the brain, but in other folks who have ADHD, a different thing is going on in the brain that leads to the same symptoms or similar symptoms but not as intense or more intense. There are multiple etiologies, multiple ways that you can get it, multiple states of the brain that lead to the symptoms of ADHD. And there are subgroups. Research is saying that we should focus more on the subgroups to help us get a richer understanding of what's going on in ADHD. And most children who are diagnosed with ADHD also have a second disorder. So that complicates the picture. When you're doing a study, you've got someone who has ADHD and anxiety, someone who has ADHD and depression. Are those apples and oranges? How do you compare them? How do you differentiate the effects of different disorders on the brain? Some of the thinking in ADHD research now is that it should be thought of not as just a category. It's like you're either ADHD or you're not. You're either in the ADHD bucket or not, but as spectrums. When we talk about what's your attention like with a particular kind of task, maybe a mathematical task, versus what's your attention like with a physical task, versus what level of hyperactivity do you have when you're just resting, hanging out, versus what level of hyperactivity do you have when you're doing a cognitive task. So these are things everybody differs to some degree in some of these. You might have someone who's just almost at the clinical, definitely has ADHD level, but not quite there in one or two of these things, but not in others of them. So we all live on all of these spectra, multiple of spectra. We all live somewhere on them. And it's a combination of many factors that gives rise to the experience of ADHD. And it changes over time. So when someone has ADHD, it could look one way when they're young, and then it could change how it expresses or what it looks like when they're older. Because it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's about the development of the brain. How does the brain develop to give rise to this disorder? That's one reason you can't get adult onset ADHD, because it's neurodevelopmental. It's while the brain is developing that it comes into being. To have an ADHD diagnosis, you have to have had it since childhood. So what is ADHD? It's defined by hyperactivity, inattention, difficulty holding attention and focus, and impulsivity. We're not able to hold back impulses to do or to go for something. It's a dysregulation of executive functioning, which we know is in the frontal lobe, difficulty with thinking flexibly, memory, especially working memory, short-term working memory, difficulty with planning and organizing, having a goal and pursuing it, difficulty controlling automatic responses. So if something happens, we automatically have an impulse, we have a response, we have an emotion. Our executive function can look at that initial response, tamp it down, or say, no, that's not the right response for the situation. That function is impaired in ADHD. And monitoring task relevance. So we've got all kinds of things coming at us. There's something driving by over there. My pet is doing something. My phone's buzzing over here, but I've got this thing I've got to focus on. Being able to screen some things out and know here's where my attention should be. That's about task relevance. What out of all the things that's coming in do I want to focus on? It's impaired in ADHD. And it's associated with increased risk of underemployment, depression, antisocial behavior, a shortened lifespan due to accidents, and physical health complications. It's something you can inherit. It's highly heritable, so it seems to have to do with your genes, which are these parts of the DNA that we inherit from our parents, mother and father. But all the studies of what genes look like in ADHD, some say, oh, it's a gene in this area of this chromosome. Other ones are like, no, it's a gene in this area of this chromosome. It's inconclusive. Looking at all the gene studies together, it's clear that it is multiple genes. It is not just one. There isn't an ADH gene on this chromosome number 3. It is across many chromosomes and in many areas across those chromosomes. And it can look different in one presentation versus another. Many little changes come together in ways that are hard to predict to give rise to ADHD symptoms. And there are many combinations of gene abnormalities that can lead to that. The most powerful studies on genes in ADHD have pointed to genes that have to do with neurodevelopment, the development of the nervous system. Things like the formation of the synapses where cells communicate with each other, or the wiring together of cells in certain complexes or certain systems, or the amount of neurotransmitters in the system, the homeostasis of neurotransmitters. The genes that control all of those factors, which are the blueprints of how we put the brain together, those seem to be the kind of genes that are affected in ADHD. Before we say more about what it looks like in the nervous system, final word on what it looks like, period. Without even looking at the brain, it is clear that ADHD has to do with the reward system. Children with ADHD find it more difficult to delay gratification. If you've heard of the marshmallow test, famous psychological test where they have kids sit in a room and there's a camera and they get one marshmallow in front of them and they're given a direction. If you do not eat this marshmallow for 5 minutes, then you will get a second one. And then some kids, they wait, and I really want to eat it, but I'm not gonna. And some kids just right away, they're like, what'd you say? They don't care. They're eating the marshmallow. The children who can wait and then they get 2 marshmallows out of it, they're delaying gratification in order to get a bigger reward. And that study followed those people until they grew up. Lo and behold, the little kids who could wait to get a second marshmallow tended to have higher income, better jobs, better grades. ADHD is associated with difficulty waiting for the second marshmallow. Once we dig in, we're going to see that this has to do with an area of the brain called the Nucleus Accumbens, the reward megaseat. It's a lot of different systems connect there to mediate our thinking about rewards and what am I going to get out of this. And it has to do with dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical that the reward system uses to communicate with itself and with other parts of the nervous system and the whole body. There's weaker dopamine signaling in the forebrain, the frontal lobes in ADHD. Related to this, there's a lower level of norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. Norepinephrine is the chemical that the Vigilance system uses to stay focused, to stay vigilant. And when there's a lower level, the system makes up for that lack of focus with more motor behavior to try and seek more stimulation, right? It takes more stimulation to get that chemical flowing and to get that system active because there's so little of it to begin with. So physical hyperarousal is trying to make up for low noradrenaline in the vigilance system. And the evidence for that is not just the hyperactive body, but also emotional dysregulation, disorder in sleeping, and dysregulation of the HPA axis. This is something we talk about in the video on depression and anxiety, where the HPA axis also plays an important role. HPA stands for hypothalamus, which is a brain structure, pituitary gland, which releases some hormones, to the adrenal gland, which releases all the hormones. The HPA axis is the bridge between the brain and the rest of the body through the release of hormones, the chemicals the brain uses to communicate to distant areas of the body, the heart, the stomach, the lungs, the autonomic nervous system, the system that uses hormones to communicate with the heart, the stomach, the intestines. And what does the HPA axis use? It uses catecholamines, dopamine, which there's less of in ADHD, norepinephrine, which there's less of in ADHD, epinephrine, also less in ADHD. So these are the fight or flight chemicals. Less of these chemicals in ADHD means dysregulation in these autonomic responses. Fight or flight, rest and digest. Doesn't work the same in ADHD. We call that dysfunction of the HPA axis. Too much or too little catecholamines also interferes with cognitive function, which is why lower catecholamine levels correlates to the low attention, disorganization, distractibility, difficulties with concentration that we see in ADHD. Because dopamine is all about attention and motivation and reward processing. You will have your reward. Jafar, Aladdin, 1992. The Nucleus Accumbens is a part of the brain that uses dopamine and is the epicenter of reward thinking. So less dopamine, the nucleus accumbens can't facilitate that thinking about reward and delaying gratification. Norepinephrine is about focus and attention, concentration, and alertness. It's also an important chemical for learning and for organizing the brain. So bringing brain cells into connection into the loops that represent our knowledge of the world, that's learning, and getting the brain to come together. Norepinephrine is one of the chemicals that helps with neurodevelopment. And it also helps organize movements in the basal ganglia. We're going to talk more about the basal ganglia in ADHD. It's got to do with the hyperactivity of movement mediated by norepinephrine. Norepinephrine in the basal ganglia helps us control movement. It's lower down in ADHD, which helps account for the movement hyperactivity. A little caveat, most of the research has focused on dopamine and norepinephrine because we know that drugs that affect those are helpful for ADHD. But research also points to other neurotransmitters that might be important, but there's just not enough research to say yet, including acetylcholine, which makes sense. Acetylcholine is what's landing on my finger muscles when they do this. It is the chemical that controls movement, so has something to do with movement hyperactivity. Also, nicotinic receptors that respond to nicotine, and nicotine-like chemicals that we produce ourselves seem to be implicated. Some interesting statistics about the high rate of smoking among folks with ADHD points to the important role of nicotinic receptors. Transmission of serotonin might be important to ADHD. Serotonin is important for mood, and there are mood disturbances in ADHD. And glutamate transmission. Glutamate is all important for the brain. Most of the connections between brain cells in our skull use glutamate as part of the transmission of messages, and it's very important to the development of the brain, getting things where they need to be. All of those probably also important in ADHD. Again, the ones we know the most about are dopamine and norepinephrine, thanks to drugs. Talking Adderall and Ritalin, also known as dextroamphetamine and methylphenidate. They increase the level of dopamine in the system. How do they do it? To answer that question, we look at our old friend the synapse, the connection between brain cells and neurons throughout the nervous system. An axon from one cell gets close to one other cell, but there's a little space between, and that's the space where it throws out its neurochemicals to try and send a message. There's less dopamine to begin with when you have ADHD because of reuptake. The dopamine goes out, but then it gets sent right back into the axon too quickly. There's a little mechanism called a dopamine transporter, which brings it back into the axon so it can reuse it for the next time it has to send a message. But it does it too fast. Adderall and Ritalin keep that transporter from bringing the dopamine back so that it stays in the synapse longer and strengthens that message, that dopamine-based message through the brain. It's similar to how SSRIs work, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which keep more serotonin in the synapse by stopping reuptake. But we are talking about Adderall and Ritalin. They improve executive function, emotional response, and reward regulation. It's a common misconception that it improves academic achievement. And some people think even if they don't have ADHD, they can pay their buddy who does have ADHD to get some Ritalin and they'll do better on their test. That is not how it works. Folks who have ADHD still struggle in school even with these stimulant drugs, but they are helpful in dealing with the symptoms of ADHD. These kind of drugs are not universally effective. 30 to 50% of kids aren't helped by Ritalin and Adderall, or they have side effects that make it hard to tolerate. And of course, these are addictive chemicals, like amphetamine, from which they are derived. So all of those are factors to consider in the psychopharmacology, the psychological drug taking around ADHD. There are some non-stimulant drugs that are also helpful, relatively new. One of these is Guanfacine, which doesn't target dopamine in synapses. It targets norepinephrine by stimulating the receptors at norepinephrine areas of the nervous system. And that strengthens connectivity in the frontal lobe, which strengthens executive function. Another important chemical to think about with ADHD is iron. People who are iron deficient are 2 times more likely to end up with ADHD. A lack of iron disrupts the dopamine system. Without iron, the cells build fewer dopamine receptors. It's like they don't have enough antennas to get the signal. And iron deficiency impairs that reuptake mechanism. Too much reuptake, not enough dopamine, and it decreases the amount of dopamine in the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia in this area of the brain, very important for emotion regulation and for movement. A deficiency of iron decreases the dopamine, which is so important to the basal ganglia, sending messages to itself, by up to 20%. losing out on a lot of dopamine if you don't have the iron to manufacture it. We're zooming out from the synapse level where the ends of each particular neuron sends its message to the next neuron. And we're going to look at actual structures within the brain. Already talked about the basal ganglia, that's right in the center of the brain. There are multiple ganglions within the basal ganglia. Ganglia is the plural, ganglion is one. So it's a bunch of different bits that are connected in the center of the brain. And one of the ganglions is called the striatum, very important to motor function. And in ADHD, that motor functioning part of the basal ganglia is poorly connected to the frontal lobe. So the movement connection from the basal ganglia area to the frontal lobe, where there is executive function, is impaired in ADHD. Also, poor connection between that striatum in the basal ganglia and the parietal lobe, which is all about movement, and to the insula, which we can't see in this picture, but if you could dig in there and open up the brain, it's inside one of the folds. That is important for interoception, for feeling the sensations inside this body, and for emotional regulation. The insula is the emotion-body connection point. All of those connections from the basal ganglia to the movement area of the parietal lobe, the executive planning area of the frontal lobe, and the emotion area of the insula, all of those are weaker. All of those rely on dopamine, and there's less dopamine in the basal ganglia in ADHD. So there's poor connectivity between the emotions, movement, and executive function. And those connections are called frontostriatal circuits. Circuits between the striatum in the basal ganglia and these frontal areas of the brain. A related network is the frontal parietal network, connection between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, with the basal ganglia in the middle of it, so all three of those are once again connected. And the three of those work together to direct attention and focus. In ADHD, there's poor connection between that attention focus network and somatosensory networks, to about right here in the parietal lobe. It's the area of the brain that tells us what we're feeling. So there's a poor connection between the intake of what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're feeling, all the data in our environment, and our planning brain, and the spotlight of our attention in ADHD. It's not only poorly connected, but when you're growing up and you have ADHD, the development of that whole system is delayed. And that frontal parietal network is over-connected to another network of the brain called the default mode network. Very important in ADHD. The default mode network is widely distributed throughout the brain, anchored in the frontal lobe, that executive lobe, and it's active when we're daydreaming, meditating, or in a flow state. But its activity in ADHD differs from its usual activity. It's more random. It isn't synchronized and rhythmic, but spotty, like static on a screen. It's poorly connected to that frontoparietal network. It's poorly connected within itself. It's poorly connected to the attention network in the brain and the salience network, which is that network that says, oh, that's what's important to focus on. Ignore that other thing. And when all of those networks are poorly connected with the default mode network, that's why there are lapses in attention. What should be a rhythmic, constant flowing of activity that keeps the mind focused gets interrupted, and the focus falls off the rails. Like the frontal parietal network, the default mode network develops more slowly in ADHD. It's stunted in development. And the activity of this default mode network is one of the things that Ritalin targets by suppressing this random, noisy, overactive default mode network and improving the connections there. Ritalin helps the default mode network because it increases stimulation of norepinephrine receptors. Norepinephrine increases the signal, the clarity, the precision, the crispness of the signals in the frontal lobe. In a similar way, dopamine turns down the noise and the grain and the fuzziness of messages that are being sent between cells in the frontal lobe. So when the levels of dopamine and norepinephrine are just right, there's a good signal-to-noise ratio. We're experiencing what we need to experience without getting overwhelmed by mental noise. Ritalin helps normalize the signal-to-noise ratio in a brain that has ADHD by improving connection in the default mode network. Within the frontal cortex, the right inferior frontal cortex, this area, is underfunctioning in ADHD. It corresponds to that difficulty with executive function. And in the visual area of the brain, the occipital visual cortex and the motor cortex up in the parietal lobe, the function is anomalous. That accounts for the difficulty focusing visually and the motor hyperactivity. Part of the cerebellum in the brain stem and its connection to the left inferior parietal lobe, which has to do with movement, also doesn't function the same in ADHD. And that's important because this connection with the cerebellum is about the timing of tasks and the movement error. So if I'm trying to thread a needle and I saw, I was too far to the left, I have to go to the right a little bit. I was too far up, I have to go down a little bit. That's all in this cerebellum area. Those little micro movement changes. That's totally unconscious for us. The system does it automatically based on what we're seeing and feeling. Well, that's impaired in ADHD. And in tasks that are about inhibition, about holding back your initial impulse, waiting for the second marshmallow, another motor area in the parietal lobe, the supplementary motor area, and an area called the left anterior cingulate cortex don't function the same in ADHD. Part of the brain differences that underlie that difficulty inhibiting our automatic responses. I already said the basal ganglia is important in ADHD. Its overall function throughout the basal ganglia is lower in ADHD, which accounts for the difference in motor hyperactivity, motor smoothness as opposed to jerkiness. And we've mentioned the Nucleus accumbens, which is the neighbor of the basal ganglia. Importantly, it is connected to the amygdala. And during reward-based tests, where there's a reward on the line, like the marshmallow test, the amygdala, our stress response. There's something important going on. I need to respond to it in ADHD. When there's a reward on the line, the amygdala is more active than usual, along with the Nucleus accumbens, that reward epicenter. There's too much hyperactivity in those brain areas, and that corresponds to the hyperactivity we see in reward-based tests with ADHD. At the same time, all of these structures are smaller, and they have fewer neurons in them. In ADHD, the amygdala, that Nucleus accumbens reward center, the whole basal ganglia, and the hippocampus, which is central to memory, including that working memory, holding in mind the first part of the problem while I'm working on the second part of it, which we know is a struggle with ADHD. These parts of the brain all have fewer neurons, smaller volume, less function. Finally, the myelination is different. Myelin is this material along the axon of each neuron that helps the message go out smoothly. When you have problems with myelin, you have problems with the messages going through the nervous system circuits. Problems with myelination are seen in multiple sclerosis and the difficulties with movement that we see in that disease. Well, in ADHD, there is abnormal myelination in some parts of the brain. There's lower myelination, which means poorer signal strength in the tracts that connect the cognitive control network and the attention network, accounting again for the difficulty between where should my attention to be and my cognitive work. There's also poor myelin insulation to the connections between the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere and the right hemisphere connect via the corpus callosum, which is totally made of axons. It's nothing but axons crisscrossing, sending messages from here over to there and from there over to here. Those axons are poorly insulated in ADHD. So there's a delay and a difficulty coordinating. Similarly, there is a connection, a myelin layer of axons connecting the frontal, parietal, and temporal cortices on the outside of the brain, and the brainstem that has those basic automatic functions, and the cortical spinal tract, which goes down the spine and connects with all the other nervous systems in the body. So there we have it. ADHD affects so many things throughout the brain, from myelination. There's something going on at the genetic level, the HPA axis. The connection to the hormone system is different. What's going on in the synapse is different. There are fewer catecholamine neurotransmitters in the synapses of some important regions. Some areas of the brain are smaller. Some areas of the brain aren't as well connected. Some connections between various brain networks, various brain systems are poorer. The basal ganglia is not as large or as well stocked with dopamine neurotransmitter. Part of the cerebellum is smaller. Like I said, ADHD is a complicated syndrome, and each part can be a little different in each person who has ADHD. But as we put all the puzzle pieces together, it makes sense why each of these differences would lead to the sort of symptoms that we see in ADHD, an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something from this and all of our other videos. As always, I'm Christoph, your guide to the human brain and nervous system.